Morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. Just give it 1 minute here while people join us, and we'll get started. Great. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Debbie Cox-Bolton. I'm the CEO of NewDEAL, and I want to welcome you to what is our second in a series that we're doing around implementing the recovery. This program focused on housing affordability, availability, and affordability. Obviously, like so many issues around the pandemic, housing was a huge challenge before COVID hit, particularly hitting hard communities of color. But like, again, so many other issues, the COVID really exacerbated that challenge. The good news is, of course, that there is momentum and a real opportunity here to make historic investment in housing, particularly given the federal funding that's coming through the American Rescue Plan, Infrastructure Bill, and others to make a difference. So we're excited today to be able to talk about some of those solutions, to talk about what's going on around the country. I do want to thank Rhino, our partners, for putting on this event together. And we have a great lineup of experts and NewDEAL leaders who will be talking about what's going on around the country. We're grateful today to start with a really special guest, Richard Cho, who's joining us from HUD, where he is a senior assistant to secretary, and in that capacity works on a variety of issues from ending homelessness to helping find wraparound services with housing and others. And we're especially grateful to him today to come talk to us about the administration's House America initiative, as well as some of the other meaningful reforms and meaningful action that can be taken through the American Rescue Plan. So Richard, with that, thank you so much for being with us. I'm sorry, I was supposed to just mention that we are going to be taking questions throughout this event. You can use the Q&A function to do that. But with that, Richard, please welcome to NewDEAL, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you to NewDEAL for having me here today. I'm excited and honored. First of all, I really am excited about the event today and the focus on housing and homelessness as part of efforts to respond from the pandemic and its economic impacts. As Debbie mentioned, I'm Richard Cho. I'm Senior Advisor to Secretary Fudge, focusing on housing and services, which includes work that HUD is doing to try to address the crisis of homelessness in America. And I wanted to talk about a new initiative that we launched in conjunction with resources that we provided in the American Rescue Plan to address homelessness. I'm going to pull up my screen here and see if I can share that. I'm hoping folks can see those slides. Okay, so I have to keep it in this particular format. But let me start with this. I think we know that over the last few years, homelessness has actually been rising, such that when the pandemic arrived in this country, there were on any given night more than 500,000 Americans who were sleeping in crowded shelters or on the streets or in vehicles or in other places not meant for human habitation across the country. We've seen even steeper rises for people who are sleeping outside. We tend to think about the homeless population as being either sheltered or unsheltered. Sheltered meaning that they're sleeping in emergency shelters. These are not permanent homes, and unsheltered where they're sleeping outside. And so for what we've seen disturbingly over the last few years is a rise in the number of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, meaning that they're actually choosing to sleep outside. And I think maybe the most visible manifestations of that is the rise in homeless encampments that we've seen all over the country. I think the trends on homelessness have caused a lot of us to despair, and certainly the pandemic has kind of laid bare the vulnerabilities that people face to a public health crisis and a deadly infectious disease when they don't have housing insecurity. If you recall, when the pandemic arrived, the message was stay safe by staying home. But think about if you didn't have a home, if you had to choose between sleeping in a crowded room with bunk beds that are stacked one on top of each other, sometimes spaced less than a foot apart, and all of a sudden guidance was put out there to say we need to increase physical distancing and maintaining a 6-foot distance. For many people, that was impossible. And for other folks who were sleeping outside, all of a sudden they had no access to public facilities. Libraries were closed. Many small businesses were closed. Other places where people could, use sort of basic have access to basic amenities no longer available to them. So people experiencing homelessness were particularly vulnerable to COVID-19 transmission, but also all of a sudden had many doors closed to them in terms of having just access to basic needs. This has caused a lot of us to sort of despair and wonder, homelessness has been going in the wrong direction. And then COVID-19 has been layered on top of that, has exacerbated the crisis. And it's caused many, I think, communities to struggle and wonder if there ever actually is a solution to homelessness. And I think I like to remind people that while the number has been relatively flat and now going up over the last few years, there was a time when homelessness was going down, and that was during the Obama administration from 2010 to 2016. And remember, this was a time when there weren't even significant new resources other than for veteran homelessness. We saw homelessness go down. It went down overall 14% for populations, 23% for families, and also nearly cut in half for veterans experiencing homelessness. And yet over the last few years, we've seen homelessness go back up, and it's gone up particularly for certain populations, people who are chronically homeless, who have disabilities, and who have long-term homeless, as well as those that are unsheltered, who are sleeping outside. In 2020, that was the first year ever when the number of single individuals who are not part of families, there were more people sleeping outside than there were in emergency shelters across the country. And so I think you can juxtapose these periods. Now, I don't certainly want to politicize this issue. I don't think it's only about sort of what was happening in Washington, D.C. over the last 4 years that really led to these rise in homelessness. We know that homelessness is largely driven by rent unaffordability. According to Zillow, their economic research, they found that homelessness climbs faster when communities hit a certain tipping points. When rent affordability reaches 22% of people's incomes, like you see a sort of homelessness at one level. When you hit a 32% threshold, all of a sudden homelessness rises faster. In this model, they have actually been able to largely trend that homelessness can be tracked, homelessness can actually be tracked against rent unaffordability levels, except there are these outliers. And one of those is Houston, where they've identified that Houston's overall homeless rate is lower than what this model would predict based on both poverty rates as well as rising rents. And that's largely because of the work that Houston's done over the last few years in really connecting people to housing faster and providing housing assistance to people using what we call a housing first approach, in which people experiencing homelessness are connected to rental permanent housing quickly with a range of different rental assistance and housing programs, and provided with wraparound support services as needed so that they can retain that housing. And Houston has done that better than many communities where they've been able to connect people to experiencing homelessness to housing faster. But of course, many communities have struggled because of the severe resource scarcity over the last several years, which is varies for different populations. Fortunately for veterans experiencing homelessness, there typically are almost enough resources to be able to rehouse any veteran who becomes homeless. For families, it's about 2 out of 3 families who are experiencing homelessness on any given day have an available housing resources. For individuals who are not veterans, it's actually 1 in 7. So for every 7 homeless individuals in any community, there's only 1 available permanent supportive housing unit or rapid rehousing vacancy or voucher or other housing intervention to be able to help them exit from homelessness. So it's no surprise that we see homelessness rising for certain individuals. Nationally, we've looked at this as well, and we've seen that one of the reasons why homelessness has been going up, it bears out in the data that we're seeing, is because annually, remember, homelessness is about the number of people who fall into homelessness every year and also about the number of people who exit. We've seen that there have been more people falling into homelessness every year than are being housed by communities. Namely, almost 1 million people, 900,000 people become homeless every year, and just under 900, or about 900,000 people exit homelessness every year. And so on average, over the last several years, you've had a growth of 8,000 or so, 9,000 people every year who kind of net increase homelessness. So a lot changed in the last year. In addition to an election, President Biden's American Rescue Plan was enacted almost a year ago today. And in addition to providing a number of other resources to help communities respond to, but also come back from the pandemic emergency, it provided dedicated resources to communities to address the crisis of homelessness, namely $5 billion through a new special purpose voucher program known as the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, HUD awarded nearly 70,000 vouchers to approximately 600 public housing authorities who need to work in partnership with their homeless service organizations to help people experiencing homelessness get rehoused. We also provided $5 billion in grant funds. These are homelessness grants that are sort of administered through the Home Investment Partnerships Program that really can fund a number of things, but really what we hope most communities will do is to use these to create additional new permanent supportive housing units, as well as other affordable housing that can serve people experiencing homelessness and add to the national inventory of housing to address homelessness. And of course, there was emergency rental assistance, $46 billion at the Department of Treasury, $350 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds that have a variety of different uses, and many, many programs at the Department of Health and Human Services that can fund wraparound services, mental health supports, addiction services, and case management that can be coordinated with housing. So this is a lot of resources in a short amount of time, and I think a lot of communities were caught off guard by the sort of amount of resources that were available, and certainly welcome those, but it was certainly a significant sort of pivot. So what Secretary Fudge wanted to do, in addition to providing resources, was say that we know we need to work with urgency. While some of these funding streams have a little bit of a longer time frame for expenditure, we knew that the crisis of homelessness was pressing and urgent. We also knew that in order to be able to achieve our goals, we need to make a near-term surge in how we use these resources to both move as many people out of homelessness into stable housing as possible, as well as add as many new units of housing into the development pipeline. And knowing how long housing development takes, we need to begin the process now of finding ways to quickly bring on new projects into the pipeline. So she launched House America in partnership with other administration officials. House America is an all hands on deck effort to address the nation's homeless crisis. It is a partnership where we at HUD, along with our partners at the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, the Department of Veteran Affairs, Department of Health and Human Services, and as well as other administration agencies, want to partner with mayors, county leaders, governors, tribal nation leaders across the country to sort of partner with us hand in hand and actually make specific commitments of how they'll use these resources to address homelessness and do so by the end of 2022. We have two specific goals. One is we're asking communities to actually set a specific target and a goal for how many people experiencing homelessness that they will rehouse into permanent housing using these emergency housing vouchers, using CARES Act funding that is still available, use other HUD and local resources, and set a specific target of how many people experiencing homelessness will be rehoused by the end of 2022. And second, to add as many new units of affordable or permanent supportive housing into the development pipeline by the end of 2022, using those home ARP grants that I mentioned, but also Treasury funds and other resources to do so. Collectively, we're hoping that we can see at least 100,000 people rehoused by the end of this year and add at least 20,000 new units of affordable and permanent supportive housing into the development pipeline. Well, I'm pleased to report that today we have, I think, close to 80 state and local leaders who have signed on to House America, who've set ambitious goals and are helping us to achieve this national progress. And they really cover the entire country from California to Maine, from Florida to Washington State, from Minnesota to Texas. Really all corners of this country are covered by these leaders. Collectively, they represent 40% or more of the nation's homelessness population. So if these leaders and these communities and many of you can help us to collectively achieve these goals, we know that we can make a near-term dent and reduction in the number of people experiencing homelessness, and also demonstrate to the public that when federal resources are provided to address the crisis of homelessness, you will see results. And that is really what House America is all about. We are working hand in hand with leaders and their teams. We're providing tools and resources, including guides on how American Rescue Plan resources can be used. We're providing new playbooks and strategies for how to quickly bring on units into the development pipeline, how to use resources to quickly identify units on the private market that people can move into using various subsidies. We're developing new landlord engagement toolkits and other resources. We hold a monthly all hands on deck call where we bring leaders and their teams together to talk about what's working, what challenges they're facing, how can we troubleshoot, as well as to facilitate peer-to-peer kind of learning, which has really been one of the highlights of this effort. We hold regular office hours where we can field questions and concerns that communities are facing in achieving their goals, and also providing individual technical assistance to these communities. And we're seeing early successes. You have examples like the City of Oakland and Mayor Schaaf, who has been a fantastic leader, was one of the first leaders to join House America. Her community's achieving impressive progress towards their goals to rehouse 1,500 people and to build 132 units of housing by the end of this year. Mayor Nuremberg in San Antonio, conducting housing surges that are enabling them to actually achieve these goals. I think a recent surge, they housed close to 600 people in a very short period of time. They're continuing to conduct these surges. Mayor Wu in Boston has actually helped resolve an entire homelessness encampment using the housing first approach, using some of the federal resources that have been provided. So we are here today. Many of you have already joined. We hope other New Deal leaders are looking at House America and are considering joining into this collective effort and helping join with us into achieving some of these national goals. You can find more information at our webpage, hud.gov/house_America, or you can also email us at houseamerica@hud.gov to find out more information. And we would be more than happy to welcome many more leaders into this national effort. And so with that, I'll stop sharing and happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Richard, thank you so much for super helpful presentation, and great to see you highlight so many New Deal leaders in there from Oakland, San Antonio. I know a bunch of folks who were mentioned in a report that we released last week on rescue plan funding for their investments in housing. So appreciate that and excited about all that's going on. As Debbie mentioned at the beginning, please, if you have questions for Richard, I know we've got a few minutes left with him, please just leave them in the Q&A and we will get to as many as we can if folks have questions. I know I'm happy to start off with one, just building on some of your comments at the end about some of the places where you are seeing impactful investments. Do you have any guidance you provide to folks about what you've seen there in terms of what are some of the key challenges you think that folks have faced to be successful, and some of the key steps, if you're getting in the weeds a little bit, that people have taken to make the investment successful?
Yeah, I think that actually the availability of these new resources has kind of woken many communities up to realize that they need to be a little bit more coordinated in terms of not only the set of partners who are working, but on quickly finding people who are experiencing homelessness who need to be assisted, and to match them to various housing resources. And what we're now seeing is communities using sort of like every tool in their toolkit. They're using some of the CARES Act Emergency Solutions Grant funds that we provided to create a rapid rehousing, which is really short-term rental assistance that can last up to 2 years, along with case management. They're also using these emergency housing vouchers, and as well as leveraging additional sort of voucher preferences and set-asides from their local housing authorities. In many ways, they're kind of stacking these resources together. So some communities are using our Emergency Solutions Grant CARES Act funds as a kind of bridge subsidy. So they're quickly able to find a unit on the private market. They're also using some of those funds to fund housing navigation and also landlord engagement activities. Many of them are using these ESG funds for landlord incentives. So they're providing signing bonuses to any landlord that kind of comes on board. And then many of them are actually being converted where the rental assistance switches over to an emergency housing voucher or other form of voucher. Really creative ways to use resources. With regard to the unit creation side, we're seeing a lot of communities purchasing and converting hotels and motels that have been used to provide a safer form of shelter. And I think hotel conversions, adaptive reuse, communities are also looking at their existing pipeline of low-income housing tax credit development and saying we have some grant dollars that we can provide through Treasury funds or HUD home ARP funds. Can we sort of buy set-asides, quote, buy set-asides in these buildings that are kind of bringing down the affordability level? So lots of innovation happening, probably more than I can share at this moment, Jonathan, but it's sort of, it shows you the ingenuity that you can unlock when you provide significant federal resources. And I think that's what collectively I hope we can see coming out of House America.
Great. I'll go to a question that we got in the Q&A. I know there's one about what, individuals and people and beyond policymakers can do to help in this effort. What are the types of things that maybe policymakers should be encouraging their constituents to do? And, I think I add on to that, we're really interested in partnerships, certainly with nonprofit, private sector. What are their roles in accomplishing the goals that you are setting out?
Yeah, I think there's things that I think people can do, both big and small. I know Mayor Adler in Austin, who's a New Deal leader. One of the things he did when he realized he was getting a lot of these federal resources through the American Rescue Plan was to engage the private sector and philanthropy to partner with him and to raise additional funds. So there's ways that the private sector has been able to sort of a mayor has leveraged federal resources to try to leverage additional private sector investment. But I think it's not always about the big dollars too. It's about the small things that we can do. I think like the public, despite what people think, I think the public is generally very sympathetic to and compassionate about the experience of homelessness. But there's, I think, a lack of understanding. I think one of the things that the public can do is to get better educated and learn a little bit more about who it is that experiences homelessness, overcome some of the misconceptions, because I think the stigma is one of the things that we find to be a challenge. I'll say I would love more people in the public to and regular citizens to understand that permanent supportive housing and affordable housing are assets to the community. They can actually improve communities. They're not things that people should avoid. I want more people joining the YIMBY club, not the NIMBY club, and really say yes to more affordable and supportive housing development in their local communities. And also help us to find landlords. Many communities are struggling to find landlords right now. The rental market is very tight. We're seeing spikes in the rental market. I know everybody knows somebody who is a landlord, whether they're a mom and pop landlord or a housing owner. Find ways to rent to units. People have subsidies. They have vouchers on hand to bring to units. And that said, I think there's also workforce shortages. The homelessness sector that is working to connect people to these resources, they are overworked. They've been struggling with COVID-related, being out of, having to stay home. There's workforce challenges. I think many of them probably could use help with volunteers. I think there's a number of things that can be done.
Thank you for that. And thank you for the reference to renting as well, which I think is something we'll talk a little bit more about as we go on in the program. I know we've just got another minute here with you. I've really appreciated your time. So final question that we got from the audience, if you could speak briefly to the use of tiny homes as temporary sheltering while permanent solutions are being established.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we found is that particularly for people who are unsheltered and outside, that while I firmly believe in the housing first approach and that we need to figure out how to get people into permanent homes, that is the solution to homelessness, that for many people who are struggling with addiction, many people who are in a state of psychiatric crisis where they are unable to make in sort of choices because they're in a flight or fight mode. And I think anybody who understands trauma understands that people who are sleeping outside, they're in a survival mode. They're not often able to really think about what's going to happen to them the next day, let alone sort of weeks from now. Many of them do need a place to stabilize. Not everyone. Many people can move from streets to home, but there are sometimes instances. When I did have a chance to visit Boston, one of the things that I found was that low threshold, humane forms of shelter where people have their own room, they can come and go as they please, they don't have to stand in line late at night. That is a way that many people can sort of just calm down and understand and sort of overcome the initial trauma of being outside. And that helps them to engage in a conversation about permanent housing. And, I find that whether it's a tiny home, and, tiny home can mean a lot of things, but other forms of interim housing that can provide a form of stabilization is a necessary part of the puzzle. But I want folks to remember, like, that doesn't solve it in and of itself. We need the permanent housing solutions. People can be stably housed. And I've seen dramatic transformation. People with very severe mental illness, very severe and kind of devastating levels of addiction have a kind of night and day transformation once they're in a stable setting and ultimately can be permanently housed. And I think when we look at people who are on the streets and we make long-term decisions about what they need based on what they're looking like today, I think it's sort of like none of us want to be sort of judged based on our worst moments and our worst days. We should really be given the opportunity to live to our full potential. And I think that that is possible. And sometimes that interim housing, like a tiny home, can be the setting in which people's full opportunity can be realized.
Thank you, Richard. So grateful for your time and all the perspective today, and look forward to further conversations as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
As we move to the next part of our program, we're going to dig into a conversation on solutions with state and local policymakers and experts from the private and nonprofit sectors. We know there's a huge opportunity to invest in these solutions now as a result of the infusion of federal funds that we've been talking about. And it's no surprise that affordable housing was one of the key themes in the report I mentioned that NewDEAL released last week, which featured case studies and investments with the American Rescue Plan, state and local recovery funds. So as we transition to the next part of our program, I want to introduce Massachusetts State Representative Andy Vargas to talk about opportunities created by the Rescue Plan, his perspective on Massachusetts's housing priorities. Representative Vargas has represented a district north of Boston since 2017 and has spearheaded legislation, to boost housing production. Prior to being elected as state representative, he served as a city councilor and became the first Latino elected official in his city. So, Representative, thank you so much, and appreciate a few comments on what you're thinking about all this funding that the state is receiving and how it can impact housing solutions.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you to HUD for the wonderful presentation that they put together. I'll quickly just say, just picking up on the last presentation, that one of the best things that we did at the onset of the pandemic that certainly helped us with all the different categories of funding that were coming down from the federal government and even here at the state level was we put together a coalition called the One Haverhill Fund. I represent the community of Haverhill. Luckily, I represent just one community, so I can do that. And the One Haverhill Fund brought together the largest social service agencies, the biggest homeless shelter that we have in Haverhill, onto weekly phone calls that turned into weekly Zoom calls where they just compared notes and they shared information and they let each other know about grants that they were pursuing, different funding streams, whether it was the FEMA money that was coming down, the CARES Act money that was coming down, or the Rescue Plan funding that was coming down, and collaborated in many cases to make sure that efforts weren't duplicative or that we weren't leaving money on the table that we could make use here at the local level. And so I think that's one of those things that isn't necessarily a policy thing that legislators can do right away. You can view your role as a public official as convening the entities that do the work on the ground and making sure that they're maximizing the resources that are coming from the federal government and the state government in some cases as well. So I offer that up for whatever use that might be helpful to folks as they think about how do we get people to work together to best maximize these funds. There were a couple of things that we did with the American Rescue Plan funding that was really exciting. The first and the one that I'm most excited about was we put in $100 million into a program called Commonwealth Builder. And the Commonwealth Builder program was a program that we created with the Black and Latino caucus here in Massachusetts, where we were trying to incentivize the production of first-time homebuyer units. And when you think about it in this market, it's really difficult for a developer to pass up on the opportunity to sell at market rate, right? Why would a developer in this market want to limit their profit, unfortunately, to selling only to first-time home buyers that earn within a certain median income? And so we created a program called Commonwealth Builder, which provides an incentive for developers of up to $150,000 per unit to sell a unit to a first-time home buyer that earns between 70 to 120% of area median income. And the idea there, the thrust of that was that as the Black and Latino caucus looked at our priorities, we were continuing to support affordable housing programs, continuing to support rental assistance programs. Those are crucial to stabilizing the lives of individuals that are about to get evicted. But we also need to have a long-term game plan here, and that is building intergenerational wealth. And that's what this program is set out to do. The Commonwealth Builder program has already built dozens of units across the state. 6 of them have been in my district, and those are all first-time home buyers that have moved in there that are low to moderate income earners. And that's exactly what we wanted out of this program. And so that's the one that I'm most excited about. The other ones are instances where the state said, we know that these programs are working, we just need to add more money into them because there's not enough. And so the homeownership assistance program that our state has, where we're able to provide down payment assistance and mortgage interest subsidy, that helps a lot. The affordable housing production programs that we had, we put in $100 million into that to help with the persistent shortage of affordable housing in our state. And with Section 8 vouchers here in Massachusetts, waiting lists are over 12 years. And then lastly, we also put $150 million in the rescue plan funding into supportive housing production. And those funds will be used to increase the production of housing for individuals with disabilities and substance use problems, which we know is a portion of our population that has a chronic issue with homelessness and housing. We also know that many of our returning citizens coming from incarceration struggle in that category as well, and finding that support housing. So those are some of the categories. In total, Massachusetts invested over $600 million of recovery money into housing programs. The approach was to both take an immediate relief strategy where we're providing emergency rental assistance and vouchers and so on and so forth, but also a medium to long-term strategy around how do we actually get to build intergenerational wealth, build more housing, get people into owning their own homes.
Representative, thank you for that. And thank you so much for both the combination of the perspective on convening and the policy piece of it, which is, of course, all very important. And I know we will be putting out something, based on this conversation today, and we'll be sure to include, some of the details that you mentioned and the context that you mentioned about what Massachusetts is doing as hopefully a guide for other folks. So thank you again. I want to now bring on our final panel for this event with folks who are leading on these issues, both from the policymaker perspective and in the nonprofit and think tank and private sector space. We're joined by the mayor of Kansas City, Missouri, hopefully joining us, Quinton Lucas, who's sworn in on August 1st, 2019, as the 55th mayor of Kansas City, youngest elected Kansas City mayor in more than a generation. And he's made housing affordability an enormous priority in Kansas City. We saw his name featured in the HUD presentation earlier. Also, Rebecca Perkins Kwoka, currently serving in the New Hampshire State Senate after her election in 2020. She previously served 2 terms on Portsmouth City Council and spent over a decade in affordable housing advocacy. She co-chairs the Bipartisan Housing Caucus in New Hampshire. Paraag Sarva, CEO and co-founder of Rhino, has been a great partner in putting this event together with us. And Rhino, a builder of products, services that give renters a more affordable way to live in the homes they want. Since its founding in 2017, Rhino has focused especially on replacing cash security deposits with low-cost, affordable insurance. Paraag also served as City Hall policy advisor and aide to former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. So fantastic to see folks jumping up onto the panel here. And hopefully we also have Michela Zonta, a senior policy analyst for housing and consumer finance policy at the Center for American Progress, who's going to moderate today's discussion. And I know it seems like we're still waiting just for Mayor Lucas to join us from Kansas City. I know we had an engagement right before this, so we will bring him on as soon as he gets here. But Michela, I will turn it over to you to lead the conversation. Thanks so much.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So first of all, I would like to thank NewDEAL for inviting me to be part of this conversation. My name is Michela Zonta, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, where I work on housing policy issues. So before we start talking about affordable housing solutions from a public and private sector perspective. I would like to invite each panelist to provide some opening remarks and discuss the importance of private-public collaborations in finding innovative solutions to address the housing crisis. And I would like to ask our panelists to kindly keep their remarks to 3-4 minutes in order to have enough time for further discussion and Q&As at the end of the event. And I guess I'll invite Rebecca Kwoka to start.
All right. Thank you everyone for being here today. And thank you, Michela, for having me. You know, I was listening to Representative Vargas talk about the numbers in Massachusetts and just over the border here in New Hampshire. You know, we were a smaller state with smaller numbers, and I was sort of envious of the programs that I heard him talking about. But it's really great to be here with you guys. You know, this is an issue that I have been working on since 2008 and 9 when I was a law school student, and it was not a hot topic back then. People were not inviting me to panels to talk about housing, but I'm really grateful that, you know, I've been able to have such a deep history in the issue, because it's just become so central, especially to our generation. I know parents my age and young families are finding housing to be such a critical piece of locating, participating in the economy at all levels, and sort of basing their lives. But it doesn't just affect us, it affects our parents who are trying to downsize. It affects our the next generation behind us that are trying to build their lives in our communities. And so you know, being able to be a part of the solution, I think, has been really meaningful. I am proud to report that tomorrow on the Senate floor in New Hampshire, we'll be voting on a bill called SB 400, which I call the Community Toolbox. And here in New Hampshire, yeah, thanks. It came out of committee with a unanimous ought to pass recommendation, and it's about a 20-page bill I've been working on for 3 years. I served on a task force created out of the governor's office to draft this back in 2019, and it has a variety of solutions in it, including the state creating something called the Housing Champions Program, where as municipalities would pass or enact housing friendly policies, the most obvious being zoning, of course, but including things like water and sewer to just support dense multifamily development, or capital improvements to provide sidewalks and public transportation to areas in town that could support denser housing, that, you know, the state would in turn provide things that municipalities need, like low interest loans on sewer and water, or extra points on their state capital improvement plan. So really trying to focus on technical solutions to the problem here. So that's kind of my exciting update for today. But, you know, I think there's a lot of other creative ways we've approached housing here in New Hampshire, because we, unlike Massachusetts, unfortunately cannot require affordable housing or income restricted you know, units under covenant as part of any new construction. We have to incentivize our municipalities to engage in that conversation. And so even though this is a tricky problem for everybody, I feel like we've had to be even more creative here. And so some other measures that I've worked on that are more short term, you know, I think we all agree that more housing units are the long-term solution, include last year, you know, extending the date for payment of rent that was due in arrears up to the date of an eviction hearing, which gave our renters an extension from the 7 days that they previously had under statute to up to 120 days to the date of their court hearing to stay in their homes, to make back payment to their landlord, keep their kids in the same school, you know, potentially keep the same daycare and commute. So that was something that went into law last year, just as the eviction moratorium lifted. And so that was work I was proud of. And then this year, we're having a problem in New Hampshire, and I'd be curious about others' experience with what we call renovation evictions. So we've seen landlords evicting tenants, under the guise that they're going to do substantial repairs or upgrades, but they really have just raised the rent and gotten new tenants in there. And so making sure that our residents have notice of those evictions, that there's sort of a cause of action for our tenants to seek legal relief under if their landlord acts in bad faith, is another measure we've been working on here. So, in addition to that, I've been kind of collaborating with the housing agencies on how we can pull down those federal funds that Mr. Cho was talking about earlier. And, I think we've had some successful attempts to provide rental assistance and mortgage assistance during the pandemic that are more probably common in other states too. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the conversation, having served as a city councilor for 4 years and a senator for 2. You're well aware that these solutions are only done in collaboration between the local and state and federal levels. So it's exciting to see all those levels represented today.
Thank you so much, Senator. I guess I'll give the microphone to Paraag Sarva.
Sure. Thank you, Michela. Thanks for having me, everybody. And I'm proud to share the stage with State Senator Perkins, Kwoka, and hopefully Kansas City Mayor Lucas, who sounds like he's still just running a little bit behind. I wanted to add one fun fact as I kind of share my opening remarks about Kansas City. And it's that renters in the city of Kansas City alone have over $142 million tied up in cash security deposits on their leases for rental homes. And so you may be wondering, why am I pointing that out? What's this guy talking about? Give me a couple minutes, just bear with me. It's going to become clearer. As Jonathan mentioned at the top of this panel, I'm Paraag Sarva. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Rhino. And I've spent the last 20 years at the intersection of both private sector and public sector. I worked for Mike Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York City during his tenure. And really about 5 years ago, set out at this opportunity around Rhino, which is to fundamentally rethink and improve the way Americans rent homes from the private sector perspective. And so what we realized was there's a massive opportunity for technology to drive positive change and impact the way renters and landlords just transact, making things easier and more efficient. And so we actually started by examining the purpose of cash security deposits. And most people don't know, but there's over $45 billion held in cash security deposits nationwide. And really, that money just sits there tied up doing nothing. It earns low or no interest, all on the off chance that something may or may not happen at the end of a lease where a cash deposit needs to cover some type of event. And so when I think about that $45 billion is really dead capital, particularly in the world we're living in today with all of the pressures that every family in America is experiencing. The newest one to add to the million and one others is gas prices going through the roof. And so we really thought critically around, why is this and how can we do something different? And so with Rhino, what we've done is leverage technology to replace cash security deposits with insurance. And so today, at nearly 2 million homes nationwide, renters can buy affordable security deposit insurance for, say, $5 a month, instead of plopping down $1,000 cash security deposit, which oftentimes is somebody's life savings or more than their life savings. And so just by building awareness and adoption of Rhino and security deposit insurance as a different, more efficient way of transacting in nearly 2 million homes across the country now, we've saved renters over $650 million nationwide in upfront moving expenses. And that's a statistic I'm incredibly proud of and really excited about. But I'll just remind you of that context of the $45 billion that's held nationwide in cash security deposits. So clearly we have a ton of work still left to do. And that's really where our nation's leaders and policymakers come in, and particularly all of the New Deal leaders. Many of them have actually already embraced this idea through what's called renters' choice legislation, realizing that through partnership with the private sector, releasing cash security deposits can be one of the important parts of tackling really this massive thing, which we're all talking about, which is the national housing crisis. space. And just to give a couple examples of New Deal leaders who have made this part of their platform and recognized how impactful it can be because it's happening today and is available today. I just wanted to mention a few folks specifically, and those are the likes of former Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley, who became the first in the nation to pass renters' choice legislation in his city, which gave over $100 million as an avenue back to renters in the city. Atlanta, Georgia Council Member Amir Faruqi, who we collaborated with to also pass renters' choice in Atlanta, which provided over $750 million back in available cash during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's many others. Virginia Delegate Mark Keem, Montgomery, Alabama Mayor Stephen Reed just published a very powerful op-ed last week, and Connecticut State Representative Quinton Phipps. And I'm really encouraged by all of this. I think it's absolutely at the intersection of how we can all come together, namely the public sectors and the private sectors, to drive real change today. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to continue to partner with more leaders and policymakers and specifically New Deal leaders, to further this cause.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure Mayor Lucas joined the event, but let me proceed with the very first question. Thank you for your critical remarks about our panelists. And this is I'd like to start with the question about the housing crisis, basically. So the country is in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis and rising homelessness, which unfortunately dates back to long before the pandemic hit. Despite a surge of assistance to renters, homeowners, and the homeless, millions of households are still facing housing insecurity. And this challenge is compounded by the fact that housing prices have continued rising significantly during the pandemic. And people of color in particular face even greater housing hardships and are more likely to have deferred or missed rental or mortgage payments, putting them at higher risk for eviction and foreclosure. So my question is, how can local leaders and private sector partners build off of the success from increased federal partnership and continue to deepen the local impact, especially with regards to people of color who experience a housing cost burden?
I'll start. I think it's a huge question, and I'm really glad you brought up communities of color, because I think we often don't talk about how in every sector, there's a disproportionate impact. It's Mayor Lucas. Fun fact, Mayor Lucas and I went to law school together. I want to defer to my other two panelists on this point too. But I think in New Hampshire, we are looking for ways that we can sort of see the opportunity in these one-time federal funds and create programs that will create change over the long term. And while so far there is no specific component of it that, I think particularly benefits communities of color, I think here in New Hampshire, raising awareness about renter insecurity was certainly accelerated by the fact that 50% of our renters experienced COVID-related job loss. And I think understanding, even here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that 55% of our population is renters, is an important piece of the housing education, because there's a tendency for those who own a home to forget that renters are part of our community and they're integral, and without them, our community would look really different and much less diverse. So I think that's been important. One thing we've seen here, in addition to the two pieces of legislation I'm working on, is an announcement by the governor of $100 million fund that will incentivize, permit granting on a faster pace, at the local level, and sort of building the capacity of our boards and our regional planning commissions to do that. And that for me is an example of investing long-term in sort of creating the capacity to approve multifamily and multi-unit projects that could create additional renting stock. So it doesn't directly address your question, but it's some of what we're at work on here in New Hampshire.
It's very, very helpful. I see Mayor Lucas join the event. Before I pass the mic to Mayor Lucas, let me see if Paraag has any response as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think two quick things I would offer that are pretty straightforward or simple. I think if I could drive a call to action. One is we have this incredible opportunity to continue to drive awareness of the problem right now. And I think Rebecca mentioned this earlier, that it was not so popular 5 years ago or many years ago to be, invited to do housing panels because quite frankly, people just didn't care enough. And so what the pandemic has shown is really, I've often been saying behind the healthcare crisis, which is obviously the number one issue we've seen in the last couple of years, the housing crisis is pretty close to number two there. Right. And so is just to continue to seize that message and make sure people don't forget, because it needs to remain top of mind for people to put together the strength and the commitment to focus on solutions. And so the second thing connected to that is really don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. And so there's so much good work that folks are doing. And I like to think that what we're doing with security deposit insurance as an option to relieve the upfront costs of these heavy cash security deposit burdens as part of that is these are all in the right direction. And to really tackle this vast problem, it's going to take 1,001 different policies, solutions, programs, products, businesses to come together. And so just really focus on what is the real world change we can make today, instead of just waiting for, say, the federal government or somebody else to, change everything all at once.
Great, thank you, thank you. So as Mayor Lucas joined our event, I will invite him to provide some remarks and perhaps follow up on these questions on how can local leaders and private sector partners build off of the success from last year's increase, the federal partnership and funding, and continue to deepen the local impact, especially with regards to people of color.
Well, I appreciate that invitation to speak, and I appreciate being on. Apologies for the delay. It's always fun in a mayor's office, and it is very good to see the former Miss Rebecca Perkins, Senator Kwoka now. I mean, my God, everybody's doing big stuff. So it is great to be with you and everybody on. To talk housing, it is something that certainly we think about all the time. When I ran for mayor, I got elected in late 2019. It was an issue we were talking about. Every problem, of course, has only been exacerbated during the pandemic. A few things that we're trying to look to do long-term that I think address it. One speaks to actually legislative solutions, particularly in tenants' rights, and ensuring that, for example, in Kansas City, we've stood up a tenants' right to counsel task force. We have given a right to counsel for every tenant in Kansas City that's dealing with different issues. And so I think that is a non-particularly monetary approach that at least is allowing us to say, how are we making sure that there are more housing opportunities through effectuation of good policy? You then look to the next step on the development or housing creation side of things. For too long, we were entirely, exclusively dependent upon developers and usually almost trickle-down model of where we get new housing. We built
Looks like we
housing tax credit areas are rolling off in terms of their time frame. And so for me, what that has largely meant is that we're first looking to see how we can be more collaborative in terms of using different sources. In Kansas City, we created a Central City Economic Development Sales Tax Fund, which helps fund housing improvement in the core inner city of Kansas City that's disproportionately Black and brown and has been an area of gross underinvestment for generations. The idea there was to give a direct cash infusion in certain areas to try to have better planning models and to make sure that we're not letting a history of non-lending from a lot of our banking institutions being an impediment to us being able to take any key steps. That's just one area that I think we've done and I think we've addressed well. Another has actually been using all of the buzzwords that seem to exist right now in housing, including transit-oriented development, not just as things that end up being one-offs in different projects, but seeing every project as an opportunity for overlay. Too often we saw in areas of economic distress in Kansas City, we were waiving lots of our good zoning rules, which is really counterproductive. But we were saying, oh my God, we can't get anything done here. So let's let somebody put up just the crummiest project ever. And then we're surprised that it doesn't work out just several years later. So what we've done is we've added transit-oriented development. We've added actually more art spaces, workspaces in connection with new multifamily construction that we're doing. And we're working with those developers actually interested in following city rules rather than working around them and wavering in any sorts of things. The other thing that I think we've done, and this is not an optimistic focus for how I guess I'm seeing it, but it's just the way it is. For those of us who find ourselves in red states or red states with blue tendencies, or complete swing states like Rebecca, then we often find the politics of actually housing creation to be frustrated, because there are some people who see houselessness as just a problem of people's wherewithal or something of that sort. There are some who I don't think are speaking the language of housing as a core utility. And so for us, that meant our local community actually, rather than waiting for state tax credits to never really catch up, looking at more opportunities, including working with the Low Income Support Coalition or LISC to help develop more housing, helping us stand up a housing trust fund, our previously mentioned local tax sources for which we can build, and then certainly better planning, zoning, and ordinance processes that allow us to actually find sustainable pathways to not just good housing, but accessible housing, to housing that is in communities of need, and frankly, to making sure that we're not just sitting back staring at the gentrification ongoing in our communities and saying, oh no, what happened? And so that's been a lot of it, but I think we still have far, far more to learn because the issue becomes more substantial each year.
Thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful. I'm afraid that we don't have time for further questions. So we have 2 minutes left, but I would love to follow up with all of you. I have tons of questions. And Jonathan, can I ask one question, or we have any questions from our audience that
why don't we do a quick, maybe lightning round on a final question for folks, like just a quick 30 seconds to wrap up. So go ahead.
We know that part of the problem today is the shortage of affordable housing. It's oftentimes a supply problem. And I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about bringing community land trusts to scale in order to really safeguard the land that is very costly, and while providing affordable housing that will stay affordable, will remain affordable in the future?
What I will say for my jurisdiction is we have looked at exploring community land trusts. We usually start at the neighborhood level instead of just a broader, and there's like a county land trust in our jurisdiction that kind of fell under its own administrative weight. But I do think you're getting quite a few folks that are trying to say, how do we make sure that we have sustainable affordability, not just our temporary improvements on areas that then aren't actually remaining affordable much longer than maybe 5 years. And so that is a model that we've explored. I think it has been helpful for us, and it's something that we will continue to build kind of neighborhood by neighborhood.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is meaningful to do at the local level. It's hard to do a one size fits all. I mean, in both Mayor Lucas's state and mine, there are very rural areas and there are more dense areas. So certainly, in places like Portsmouth, it's a more urgent conversation than in some of our rural areas. But it raises the question of what is the taxpayer's will to get involved in that. And even the short, 4 years ago, I was on council, there was not political will for taxpayer spending for that kind of investment. But I would say the situation has changed now, and it is something they're exploring. So that's nice to see. You know, in the absence of being able to do land trusts at scale, like Mayor Lucas said, there's always zoning changes, and there's always sort of making sure that you're using things like density bonuses to bring the kind of dense development or infill development that, you know, the municipality not being able to make that investment at least makes the private investment worthwhile and invites it in. So.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all our distinguished panelists. And Jonathan, I pass the mic to you.
Terrific. Yes, just echoing my thanks to Senator Kwoka, Mayor Lucas, and Paraag from Rhino. And thank you to Rhino also just generally for your partnership in putting this event on today, and with all of the leaders that you mentioned that have been working with you guys to reduce really the burden on renters and make housing more affordable in a really tangible way. So we really appreciate that. And of course, thanks again to Representative Vargas from Massachusetts and for Richard Cho from HUD. Please, if you have questions for any of our folks that come up, any of the folks who are on with us today, you know, please reach out and let us know. And with that, as we wrap up, I'll just let folks know that we will be following up with kind of a recap, takeaways from the conversation today. I would ask you to just stay tuned also for more discussions in our series on implementing the recovery. And of course, that will be continuing as well at our Spring Ideas Summit. We'll be gathering in Philadelphia on May 23rd and 24th. Looking forward to seeing many New Deal leaders there. If you have any questions about that, please reach out. And Michela, thank you so much for moderating our conversation. So with that, great to see everybody, and we will be in touch again soon. So long.